All right, it is 2:01 on my clock, so I think I can officially get started. I'm sure that others will join in as I give this little introduction here. So thank you everyone for joining. Welcome on this sunny afternoon in Brussels. Glad that people know who AA is. Alexandre is behind that little EU DisinfoLab logo there. Anyways, welcome to our next what we call network events. So this is really events that we are hosting collaboratively within the EDMO BELUX network, and that is the European Digital Media Observatory for Belgium and Luxembourg. I am the lead coordinator, Trisha Meyer, and I am a professor at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. The EDMO BELUX project or hub aims to provide research, fact-checking, and media literacy activities in understanding really the disinformation phenomenon in the Belgian and Luxembourgish context, but of course within a much larger European scene. And today we are revealing the findings of our first investigative report, which was done collaboratively between EU DisinfoLab and the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. We will be organizing such events and webinars on a monthly basis. We will be able to give you the save the date for the next one in June at the end of the webinar. This particular report was investigating how we noticed the switch over from anti-corona really measures to something that is really kind of pro-Russian in online networks. It has a European scope, global scope, but at the same time really focuses on Dutch-speaking Telegram channels. And our two authors are present with us, so Maria Giovanna and Tom will both be presenting their parts of the research. What's really interesting in this is that we see that there really is a global context here that is shared between these two events or these two narratives that are present, anti-vax and war propaganda. And that the tech context is also similar. So it's really interesting to see how these narratives flow and how disinformation really shows how it's adaptable it is, how circular it is in some ways. And we're really excited to reveal these components to you. So let me briefly introduce our two authors. So Maria Giovanna Sessa is a senior researcher at EU DisinfoLab, and Tom Willaert is a researcher in digital methods at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. Tom is also the day-to-day project coordinator of the EDMO BELUX project. So with that, I'll hand over to Maria Giovanna. Thank you.
Thank you, Trisha, and welcome everyone. So without further ado, what I will present today is the more, let's say, visual part of our study, the qualitative analysis, where we tried to compare and look for similarities and parallelisms in narratives between the Ukraine war and the pandemic. So I will present now the narratives that we have identified and then we describe in the report, starting from the first one, which is, we call this things are escalating. And why are things escalating? Well, because disinformation is very capable of adapting to the surrounding environment. And it also mirrors what happens in the information sphere. So disinformation, when a crisis occurs, will try to fill into the information vacuum. And at the beginning of both the Ukraine crisis and the COVID crisis, there was the idea that something new was happening, but it was hard to grasp information. And therefore, we encountered, in this case related to the Ukraine war, an overwhelming amount of images, especially in the forms of videos and photos, decontextualized, that actually showed war scenes from other countries, from other periods, sometimes even from video games, and they were shared in the context of the Ukraine crisis. And as you can see, this really contributes to polluting the debate and to increase what we called the information disorder. Similarly, during the pandemic, we encountered a huge number of claims that were entirely fabricated and false at the time, especially in January 2020, when there was this idea that this faraway virus would maybe at some point reach Europe. So Oaks is really focused on giving the alarm that actually the pandemic was had already arrived to various European countries. And I would say that the general goal of these escalation narratives is to startle the audience, to increase alarm and chaos. Moving on, we have encountered a great number of narratives that try to justify the Ukraine war, calling it a reaction for a genocide. This below that you see on the bottom right of the slide is actually a statement that actually Putin made on February 21st in the speech that was then known as the Declaration of War, where he says that there is an ongoing genocide in Donbass that would actually allegedly justify Russia's invasion. Similarly, such a strong claim as the one of a genocide or a plan for global depopulation was recurrently adopted in the context of COVID-19. As you see on the slide, we have a manipulated image that shows that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation would allegedly actually be dubbed Center for Global Human Population Reduction, which of course is false. Next slide, please. Brings us to the third narrative. Thank you. That we call the reductio ad Hitlerum. So basically, this is, of course, an ironic label for something that is a rhetoric means to actually disqualify any opponent by comparing it to one of the protagonists of Europe's darkest hour. And so, again, this connects very much to the justification of the war in the context of Ukraine, as we had claims, at least in the very beginning, that Russia's intention would be to, quote unquote, denazify Ukraine. And to support this kind of claims, we have encountered various hoaxes that show, for instance, President Zelensky holding a football jersey that has a swastika on it, and this is a doctored image. Or again, they contextualized images from other protests, or as in the case of the one that we are showing on screen of a movie set that was actually claimed to be ongoing current Ukraine. Similarly, the idea of Nazism and the victimhood that this awakens was employed by COVID-19 disinformers, and in particular anti-vaxxers that used, for instance, they contextualized images to like the one on the right, which actually represents a demonstration in Poland in remembrance of the Nazi crimes. And it was actually shared to say that it was a more recent protest against the vaccination campaign. Or again, claims that the Nazi health pass would resemble very much the health pass. And so also comparing those who decide not to get vaccinated against COVID to the Jewish victims of the Third Reich, which is, of course, absurd. Next slide, please. Other two narratives, and I am sure that all the ones that are listening to us today have encountered them on their own, are the claim of secret labs, which is definitely a conspiracy narrative that blinks an eye to QAnon beliefs, to deep state beliefs, and this is strikingly similar. A piece of disinformation that was actually endorsed by Russia and Chinese media says that the US is funding biolaboratories in Ukraine, which would produce weapons, and that would indirectly justify the invasion. And one could say to celebrate and praise Putin in a way that we have seen with President Trump before, as a sort of hero that would actually fight against this evil establishment that is plotting to destroy the world. And this is very similar, of course, to all the claims that we have met during the pandemic, with the very famous yet unproven claim that COVID-19 was fabricated in a Wuhan lab and then escaped it, either intentionally or by mistake. Another narrative delves into denialism in the era of post-truth. Of course, it is very hard to have this conversation that wants to distinguish fact from opinion, to some believe that facts are questionable and relative, and this is the case of individuals who end up mistrusting the idea that there is even a war or a pandemic at all. And we have chosen two hoaxes that are, I would say, identical. We have people in body bags, and in the case of COVID-19, this is actually a decontextualized image from a music video, where an actor is taking a break on set, and yes, he's in a body bag, but no, he's of course not that. It is an actor smoking a cigarette, or a climate protest in Austria that was then shared to claim that actually it was in Ukraine, and and both narratives were used to deny the existence of victims of the virus or the conflict. Next slide, please, as we approach our very final narratives. We've encountered many hoaxes that are basically clickbaits and are emotional stories that try to gather the public's attention. And of course, there are, and there have been, many victims of the war and of the pandemic that are real. However, malign actors sometimes choose false or decontextualized images in order to obtain the goal, which is basically to have likes, views, and to convince users to click on these moving sob stories, as in the case of the of the Ukrainian boy who's crossing the border. This is a real image. This really happened. However, the contextual information with which it was shared were inaccurate. The boy was said to be crossing the border alone, while in this specific case, he was actually with his family. Or the image of a woman crying for her daughter was actually shared in the context of the pandemic to say that it was actually due to the government mismanagement, but it was actually a very old video from previous years. Last but not least, and this is a very important narrative that unfortunately we expect to increase in the future. It is what we define as the negative othering of migrants and refugees. We're seeing these more and more, especially in countries where migration is a polarizing topic. The screenshot on the top right is actually the caption of a video that some of you might have seen of a German woman claiming that a boy was beaten, heavily beaten to death by Ukrainian refugees because he was speaking Russian. This is, of course, false, and it was debunked. And we have other examples. We have a very interesting study from Polish fact checker Demagogue, who actually collected many hoaxes against migrants, like, for instance, that There is a majority of non-white males with criminal records trying to cross the border and flee Ukraine, when it is actually, as we know, a majority of local Ukrainian population, especially composed of women and children. And finally, we have seen many similar debunks about migrants and false claims, like that, pushing the idea that there was a double standard, that, for instance, while the population was at home in lockdown, migrants would roam around with no rules, not respecting containment measures. And of course, the goal is to increase indignation in the population, to polarize and to portray a false, damaging, and very dangerous image. And I will leave it to that. I will be happy to take questions later, but for now, let's hear it from Tom for the more quantitative part of our study. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Giovanna. Next slide, please. So our qualitative analysis gave an overview of narrative trends surrounding the COVID pandemic, as well as the war in Ukraine. And as Maria Giovanna has demonstrated, you could see clear similarities or parallels between narratives surrounding both events. Now, the next question that comes up then is, can we also observe within a single community this transition from first embracing a narrative surrounding the pandemic and then switching to narrative surrounding the war in Ukraine? And the case study that I focused on to investigate this was the discourse on Dutch-speaking Telegram channels. So Telegram, as you know, is a messaging platform, and it has the option to open a channel basically where the owner of the channel can share messages, can write messages and send them out into the world. And these channels can be public, so they can be openly accessible to anyone who has the app, or even in most cases you can preview those channels from the browser. And so the question then was, how can we collect a data set of, let's say, communities or channels that is specific to COVID-19 conspiracism? And this is actually work that I started together with some colleagues already last summer. So during the height of the pandemic, during a summer school at the Digital Methods Initiative in Amsterdam, we collected a data set of 225 channels that were known conspiracy-oriented or far-right channels. So what we then refer to as Dutch-speaking fringe channels. And the way in which we collected these was actually through a scraper that we built. So the thing with Telegram is that it's very hard to look up channels if you don't already know the name of those channels. So in order to capture really the full landscape of all these conspiracy-oriented Dutch-speaking channels, we started with a what you could call a seed list of channels. So a small list of channels that were, to us as then people investigating this domain, known as conspiracy-oriented channels. And from there on, we used a method that you could refer to as a snowballing method. So it's really the metaphor of taking a small ball and rolling it down a hill, and the snowball gets bigger and bigger. So what we did here was we actually repurposed the affordance of Telegram that you can share messages between channels. And so the idea is that if a channel shares a message from another channel, there's a meaningful connection between both. So they can overlap in terms of content or orientation that they have. And so starting from this small list of channels, we then started adding to our snowball by including in our network every channel that was forwarded from within those smaller sets of channels. And so we let this snowball grow and grow until we ended up with 225 channels. We initially used this data set, and this is also still ongoing work to examine COVID conspiracy discourse. But in the background, I kept scraping this data set because I was interested and curious to see where it would lead. And of course, in the end, this meant that I had a very large data set spanning the period March 2017 until March 2022. So this also includes the start of the war in Ukraine. So this was a good candidate to actually test this hypothesis that maybe at some point in time, these COVID communities would also embrace discourse on the war in Ukraine. Next slide, please. So the question then is, how can we, once we have assembled such a large data set, so this includes text as well as images, how can we actually detect these upcoming or switching narratives in a bottom-up way? So there's a lot of research already out there that quantitatively shows that the term coronavirus, for instance, at some point is overtaken in frequency by the term Ukraine in these channels. But this, of course, already presumes that you know that you want to find statements referring to the coronavirus pandemic or to the war in Ukraine. I was more interested to figure out in a bottom-up way, like what is actually coming out of these channels without having any assumptions of what is actually in there. And so the method that I used to investigate this and to detect these narratives is a method from corpus linguistics, or corpus-based discourse analysis called Keyness Analysis. And what it refers to is that you basically take a target corpus, so a small subset of your text, and you compare it to a reference corpus, so the remainder or larger corpus that you have in your data set, and you compare for each word the relative frequencies in both of your corpora. And this allows you to see or to detect words that have a substantially higher or comparatively higher relative frequency in one data set versus the other. And then you add this, you translate that into a statistic. So I won't go into the actual formula here. But so the way in which I approached this was to split the data set up into weeks. So I extracted the texts from all of the messages, from all of the images. So using OCR, so optical character recognition. And then I also filtered them by language, so using language detection algorithms, and this gave me different data sets to play with. And so I split them up by timestamp. So for instance, all of the texts that are in the first week of the data set, and then I calculated the keyness scores for all of the words in that first week as compared to all of the remaining weeks in the data set. And I did this for every week. So this gives you actually for each week the scores, keyness scores for all of the words that are in the data for that week. We can move to the next slide, please. So what is interesting here is that you can then sort of inductively see which words have a high keyness score, so which words are statistically interesting for a specific week, so that they have a highly positive score. But you can also see which words have a very low keyness score, which means that in terms of frequency, they're actually not very distinct as compared to previous weeks or other weeks in your data set. And so the first observation that we could make then, once we visualize this, as is seen here, is that you actually see all of these sort of weird terms coming up for each week. So really salient terms that could be interpreted as signals for emerging narratives. So really words that are characteristic in terms of their frequency for that specific week. And if we look at the example here, so this is, I would say, a section of this whole timeline of data that we collected. You can see that in the last 4 weeks of the data, we start seeing these emerging references to the war in Ukraine. So remember, this is a data set that was originally collected because it was representative for coronavirus conspiracy groups. And you can see, for instance, if you look at the week of February 27, so that's the second column in this table, you can see that there are words like bombard, denazify, demilitarize. So really, very clear evocations of the Ukrainian conflict. And this also coincides quite correctly in time with the start of the war. Then we see some even, well, maybe weirder things still in the final week. So if you look at the week of the 13th of March, you have terms like biolaboratories, for instance. And without any context, that might seem a weird term. But of course, as Maria Giovanna already explained, this is one of these big recurring conspiracy theories, namely that there are biolaboratories in Ukraine, and this is sort of a justification for the war. So in terms of this graph, two conclusions can already be drawn from this bottom-up inductive data analysis. So we see that there are emerging narratives that can be quite heterogeneous. We saw, for instance, this denazification narrative, this biolaboratory narrative, this sort of bubbled up out of the data set. But if you look at the bottom of the graph, so the words that have a low Keyness score, you can also see that there are certain stable undercurrents, you could say, and we observe these throughout the data set. And if you look at those terms, they're often very much focused on the typical like anti-lockdown, anti-mask, anti-state narratives. So really still, you could say the core conspiratorial or the core narratives of these types of communities. So that's a first impression. So there's this dynamic between having something that is stable over time, having something that is very recognizable, and then these emerging interesting new narratives. Next slide, please. A second observation, and this is another type of visualization where we look then for specific occurrences of these words with their Keyness scores, again plotted for each week, was that there are recurring narratives that as Maria Giovanna already illustrated also in her overview of different narrative trends, that sort of bridge the gap between the pandemic on the one hand and the Ukrainian conflict on the other. So you see, for instance, that in the final weeks of the data set, so around March 2022, words like biolaboratories, biolabs, bioscientists have a very high Keyness score. So they are substantially more frequent there than what you would have in comparison with the remainder of the data set. We also see that there's another time window around June 2021. So really you could say another wave in the pandemic, really, where we had this flaring up of the pandemic, that there as well, these terms again have this high Keyness score. So there people also refer to biolaboratories, and this became a strong narrative at that point in time. But contextually, they were different. So one was about the pandemic, it couldn't be about the war because the war hadn't started yet. And then the other was very clearly about the war. So we see that there is this recurrence of narratives that are recycled for different contexts. And you also see that if you look for a term like coronavirus, it has this very neutral almost signature. So it's very close to zero throughout the data set. So meaning that this is really one of the entrenched narratives in the data set. It's a bit higher in the beginning of the set because there we still had the actual outbreak or the period around the outbreak of the pandemic. Next slide, please. And then a final conclusion that I want to draw your attention to is that we here focus specifically on this case of the Ukrainian conflict and then comparing that to the coronavirus pandemic. But what this analysis actually shows, and this still needs a lot more work and a lot more closer inspection and interpretation, is that these emerging narratives are, you could say, remarkable points or salient points in a continuous process where these communities actually continuously embrace world-changing events and integrate them into their predominant narratives, so their anti-state narratives, their very conspiratorial narratives. And I don't know if it's very visible on the slide here, but what we could see, for instance, was that there are references to the freedom convoys, for instance, that were very prominent in Canada at a certain point in time. So again, leading up to the war in Ukraine, actually. And we can see all sorts of emerging terms, you could say, throughout this period of time. So this is, again, testament to the flexibility of these narratives and also of these communities to actually embrace world-changing events and position them and integrate them into their core narratives and core stories. So next slide, please. Some general conclusions that you can draw from this analysis that also speak to the mechanisms, basically, of how disinformation works. You could say that a good or a successful narrative in terms of disinformation has a stable, recognizable foundation. So there's aspects of it that clearly resonate with the community, that are recurring. But you also need something new. So these narratives also need to be flexible and adapt to world-changing events so that they remain relevant and interesting. So the biolabs narrative is a good example of that, for instance. So at a certain point, it sort of gets a breath of fresh air when there's a new context wherein there are some indications that maybe there were American biolabs in Ukraine and so forth. So that narrative gets launched back into the main discourse at that point in time. And then what we also see, and this is maybe already anticipating a little bit on the question of what can you actually do with results like these. Well, we see that certain narratives are quite recurring, that they come back over time. So in terms of mitigating the problem of disinformation, you could imagine that by studying these recurrent narratives, we can anticipate already that at a certain point in time, there will be a new crisis and we will probably see similar narratives popping up again. And of course, what is also very clear here is that these narratives can recur because basically the pipelines are there and they're ready to be filled. So we see, for instance, on Telegram that these narratives seem to recur without any without much impedance. So there's also the question there, where will this go? How can we understand better how these platforms actually facilitate the creation of these narratives? So those are two lines, I would say, also that point a bit more towards a normative approach to disinformation on this platform. So to end the presentation, I just briefly want to point out or share that within the reports, there's a link to an online tool that you can actually use to explore some of these graphs interactively. So the link is included in the actual presentation. So if you look at the bottom, it says there's an online demonstrator, and maybe if we have time, I can still show some examples of that. But I leave that up to the moderator and see if we need to go to questions first. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Maria Giovanna. Thank you, Tom, for presenting the findings in a very succinct way. We have quite a number of questions. I'm going to start with a set of questions from. So Maria Giovanna, Raquel asks, apart from the switch, it actually is relevant to both of you, but maybe you can take this one. Apart from the switch, have you monitored disinformative cross narratives linking both topics? That is one question. And the other one that I'd like to put in here for you right now, Maria Giovanna, is from Adeline. Have you noticed whether those different narratives are distributed to the same extent across different media? Or are they perhaps targeted towards different age groups?
Yeah, thank you. So concerning the first one about an overlapping of narratives regarding the context of COVID-19 and the Ukraine war, I would say that we have seen occasionally some conspiracy memes, especially online, suggesting that the war was invented as much as the virus. I have this image in my head of the comic of a virus and as it was personified, and the one of a bomb walking hand in hand and kind of plotting, you know, to ruin the world. But most importantly, I would say that, and also concerning to what I mentioned earlier in terms of the escalation of the anti-migration narrative, we have encountered some suggestions that, for instance, Ukrainian refugees would only be accepted in European countries if they were to be vaccinated against COVID. And of course, this would mobilize anti-vaxxers to say that even refugees would not be spared from the quote unquote health dictatorship. And finally, I believe that I have read online some conspiracy threats suggesting that, for instance, now all the international attention is focused on Ukraine. So we have kind of, let's say, to put it really abruptly, found a new toy to play with. And so COVID-19 is not so important anymore. And that would kind of explain the decision to loosen up some of the containment measures, as many countries are doing right now. So more to this extent, I would be curious to see if this would happen more. And I'm sure that it will, because we have already seen, as Tom really well showed us, that at least these two areas of disinformation often meet in the same communities. And to move on to the second question about whether different narratives are distributed or not across the same or different media. Well, something that I might have forgotten to mention, but it's pretty clear from the beginning of our report, is I have drawn data for the qualitative part on data of fact checkers. So we are kind of, I wouldn't say limited, but bound to what fact checkers decide to verify and debunk, which is useful in terms of offering a kind of diverse overview of the type of disinformation that we encounter online. Of course, does not allow us to select through media, and of course, age group demographics are not something that we have in this specific case. However, what I can say is that many experts have called the Ukraine war the first TikTok war, given the importance of the platform in conveying part of the information and disinformation around the conflict. So I certainly have noticed that, especially the first military escalation hoaxes regarding decontextualized images of explosions, buildings collapsing, war scenes in general, since they are very graphical and also often very brief, they resonate well with the type of content that TikTok offers. And so we have seen them indeed massively on TikTok. Finally, I think it's also important to remember that fact checkers tend to concentrate their attention on most viral disinformation that reaches the greatest amount of public, and this often coincides with very large platforms. So we are mainly seeing disinformation as of Twitter and Facebook. So I'm sorry that I cannot give more details referring to that, but let's leave it here for now. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I have two questions, or three questions actually, for Tom then. The first is from another AA, this time anonymous attendee. Why do people who are following pandemic Telegram channels suddenly switch to pro-Russia? What is their motivation? And then some methodological questions that Francesco Poldi is asking for a friend. How did you make the scraper first of all? And then what is the ratio of the images for which you've been able to use OCR successfully versus all the images with some text in it? Also, how much is your OCR method successful? And what about the videos? We'll take that and then we'll do another round of questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the interesting questions. So the sudden switch question, I wonder, the more I think about it, how much of a sudden switch this really is, because you obviously can see that there are underlying meta narratives, you could say, that tie these together quite easily. So there is this mistrust in the mainstream media, this distrust of government often. So this has been referred to in the literature as state phobia or deep state phobia. So in the US, we've seen this with the QAnon conspiracy, for instance. So I think the way to frame it is just to see that people use narratives to make sense of the world. We live in quite chaotic times. So we've been confronted with the pandemic, and then the next day there was a war on the European continent again. So people want to organize this chaos in some way, and they use narratives to do that. That's how we as humans basically work and make sense of things. So in that sense, it's not that much of a step to say this biolaboratories narrative or this belief in the media sort of helped me through the pandemic in some way, and then maybe it will also work for this new crisis. So I would say, yeah, it's a characteristic of narratives that they allow us to make these connections between seemingly very disparate events, and that's also what we're seeing here to an extreme extent, maybe, but nonetheless, I think that's basically an explanation that you could give for what we're observing. Regarding the technical question, so how did I build the scraper? The scraper is written in Python, so it uses Selenium, which is a web driver that is often used to automate testing of websites. And what I do is I basically use it to open and crawl the browser previews of Telegram channels. So public Telegram channels can be fully viewed in the browser. And in that way, it becomes just a website that you could scrape using Selenium or any other web scraping tool. So I don't use the Telegram API to do it. That's maybe what the question is directed at. And then in terms of the OCR, I have to check. To be honest, I didn't benchmark the OCR method. I just used what was available off the shelf and extracted text from images and worked with what could be extracted. It's definitely far from perfect, but it's what is available. And again, I wanted to include the images. It was the first time that I actually did it, because I feel like indeed Telegram is, as many social media, an increasingly visual medium. So we need ways of dealing with this multimodal sort of setup. And because I'm more used to working with text, my first step in that direction was to extract text also from images. And that's basically how I approached this. But it's something that I can check in the documentation also of the script that I used to do it.
Thank you, Tom. Maria Giovanna, back to you. Marina Tulin asks, could you share some reflections on why we find so many similarities between hoaxes related to COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine war? So that is take two for you this time. For example, is it because the hoaxes are spread by the same actors like Tom presented, or is it because the same disinformation strategies work across topics, or are there perhaps other reasons? We'll take that, and then there's a question for both of you. Keep the questions coming. Thanks.
Okay, so I will try to be concise to leave space even to other questions. Thank you. This is a very good one. And I would say that there is a combination of reasons. Of course, when we are tackling this information, it's always very difficult to find only one reason. And a part of it, of course, it's based on our assumption and our hypothesis as experts, but then at some point, who knows? I would say that, of course, there are similar strategies across different topics, and similar strategies to the extent that disinformation tries to seek similar responses, whether it is to simply alarm the public and contribute to the information disorder, or to push a secondary agenda, like it can be in the case of xenophobic hoaxes. So definitely, I would say that the means is the goal sometimes. And also, what I really care to mention is that disinformation communities right now, they are very hybrid, they are very diverse, and we are really overcoming ideological boundaries sometimes for tactical convergence of narratives. So a positive thing, although it's worrying, of course, is that I believe that we're past the idea that even people who are part of the Telegram channels that Tom observed are extremists per se, or are necessarily capable of offline violence. It is very difficult, of course, to assess that, and some of them certainly are. But what is also very important is that right now there are very different profiles of people who engage in disinformation and are close to these outlets and groups. They are usually individuals who have felt disappointed, and disinformation kind of preys on this pre-existing mistrust in institutions and in the government, and really plays on the vulnerability and the need for answers of these individuals. So this is also probably why similar narratives resonate well with these communities. Thank you.
Thank you. It also partially starts to answer the following question. So I'll pass the floor on to Tom for that one, but feel free to also jump in again, Maria Giovanna. So Jason Morris asks, in looking at the data, did you have a sense that these are just ordinary people discussing these topics spontaneously on their own, or is there an indication that ideas could have been seeded as part of an influence campaign? It would be interesting to do a network analysis of those user IDs, mentioning Ukrainian topics to see if there was an indication of Russian influence.
Yes, so that's a good question. To answer it, well, what we looked at in the study are Telegram channels, and Telegram is quite a complex platform because you have many options. You have there's messaging, where it's quite similar to WhatsApp, and people interact with each other. That can be in a group, but a Telegram channel is something different. And our colleague Nathalie van Rammen, who I guess is also in the audience, in her research described these as one-to-many communication channels, where basically you have the owner of the channel, the person who created the channel, who can then send out messages through the channel, but there is no real way of interacting with those messages within the actual channel. So some users have found workarounds where they implement a link to a discussion group somewhere else underneath the post. But it's really hard to say who or what is behind a channel. So there's just a description, it has a name, and that's what you have to work with. So I think one indeed of the most urgent, research questions or things that we have to look into is, what is the actual interaction between these specific affordances of Telegram and the types of messages that we see? So we sort of recycled this affordance of being able to share messages to then, or forward messages to then map these networks of shares between channels. But indeed, who is behind these channels? What would it look like if you could indeed interact directly with these messages? So these are all open questions that I think are very relevant, but that aren't addressed in the case study yet, because there was this focus on channels rather than groups, for instance. But very relevant point, and indeed something that we should take into account going forward.
If on that note, I may add something more from the perspective again of fact-check disinformation for as partial it can be, because indeed fact-checkers have to decide on what content to focus their attention. I would say that as often happens, that it's happened with COVID-19, there is an overabundance of what appear to us as regular users. Of course, we photograph an image that might not be the original source where the idea stemmed, where the oak stemmed, but they might simply act as amplifiers of the oaks. There is a number, of course, of at least when they are accessible, Russian state media that gets fact-checked, and that we are, of course, able to say that these are part of an influence campaign or a general propaganda action by Russia. But something that I find very interesting, and we're beginning to see more research on that, and that would definitely be something that we need to focus our attention on, is what have been dubbed as information entrepreneurs. So we have seen a proliferation of accounts, for instance, on Twitter, that even sometimes rapidly grow many followers that act as actors that simply spread information and often disinformation about the ongoing conflict, about the evolution of the war. And of course, they really call for our attention, because we're not able to say who is behind, or and we should really, be careful about the type of underlying idea that they are pushing by providing coverage of the event.
Thank you. And I would point out to everyone that in the chat, there's some chiming in from Nathalie van Ramdonk, who says nothing to add, nothing to add to what Tom says, but except that you might be able to see channels as kind of sort of influencers as they share their own information to put it into the Telegram ecosystem, or they serve as aggregators. And Ricardo Mendez mentions that one difference is the concept of forwards. Some channels create much more original content than others. Many are an eco box for sharing and forwards from other influencers. So really interesting, kind of to see how the Telegram ecosphere works in that context. I don't see any other questions that have come in, and I think we've probably exhausted Maria Giovanna and Tom's capacity to answer at this point. Actually, I know we haven't, but nonetheless, I will warmly thank both of the authors, both for the research and the study that they've done, and for the nice presentation and question and answer, and our audience for having been present today, for having asked a lot of firing questions, and warmly invite everyone to our next event, which will be on June 9th. So in just over a month. As a reminder, we're trying to organize these type of things, either in-person kind of networking type, or more on really informing the community that's doing work there on countering disinformation in Belgium and Luxembourg. The next one will be with Crossover. Crossover is a small-scale media study, which EU DisinfoLab is responsible for, that only has coverage over Belgium, but we'll have an event with Crossover analyzing recommendation algorithms in Belgium. I know that there are some people from Luxembourg in the call, and I promise you we will have things that are also Luxembourg specific. I would also like to point out that we warmly invite you to join our community, which will make it a little bit easier sometimes for you perhaps to see what's going on, get our newsletter, which Leticia in the background is ramping up for you. Good old email subscribe here. Also follow us on Twitter. We're available on LinkedIn as well. And our website is, as mentioned, available. We have content available in 5 languages. If you want to learn more Luxembourgish or kind of practice your German, you also can do that in this hub. But anyways, with that, check out the report. It's available on our website. Hit subscribe. I've always wanted to do that. And follow us on Twitter. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you for the very interesting questions. We have a lot of follow-up to do, I think. So